And with that, let's take it away. We're going to start with this wonderful panel, and Tony Alexander will get you going.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here today. Early morning here on the West Coast because I'm based in LA. But my name is Tony Alexander, and I am a program associate with with Communication First, which advocates for people with speech-related disabilities. And I'm happy to be here today to talk about impacted families in crisis response. I mean, when we talk about this issue about people who are experiencing mental health crises, it's important to look at a different lens, right? Different perspectives, and to really talk about all of the people who are impacted by these situations. So I have a wonderful panel with me today. I have Miriam Pearsall, who's a mental health policy professional, as well as a mental health advocate with lived experience. She currently works as a behavioral health policy associate at the National Academy for State Health Policy, and serves as a board member at the Confess Project, a nonprofit dedicated to the mental health of Black men, boys, and families. Miriam has previously worked in philanthropy, state government, management consulting, and as an AmeriCorps Vista. In her blog post, From a Moment of Crisis to a Reason for Hope, supporting the launch of 988, Miriam shares about her own mental health crisis in the fall of 2020 and her hope about how 988 could transform emergency mental health care by catalyzing the creation of a comprehensive, trauma-informed crisis care continuum. Miriam holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton University and a master's degree in public health with a concentration in health policy and management from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. And we also have Carleen Ponder, who of course is the Director of Disability Rights and Housing within the ARC of the United States. I don't really have your bio, so if you want to include more along the way, feel free.
Sure. I come from a pretty diverse background. So before I joined the ARC of the US, I was an appellate attorney with the Social Security Administration for 2 years, working directly on disability benefits and doing regulatory compliance work there. So I'm excited to be doing more of the policy aspect of disability now. But the dual side of me is I am an activist on law enforcement accountability in my local community. Crisis response is a huge personal topic. The reason I became an activist is because I have seen too many people in mental distress fatally shot, quite frankly, once law enforcement is involved in the scenario. So thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Vesper Moore. Vesper is an Indigenous activist, trainer, writer, and psychiatric survivor. They have been advocating as a part of the MAD and disability rights movements for several years and have been the recipient of many social justice and diversity awards. Vesper has brought the perspectives of MAD labeled mentally ill, neurodivergent, disabled people, and psychiatric survivors to national and international spaces. They have experience working as a consultant for both the United States government and the United Nations in shaping strategies around trauma, intersectionality, and disability rights. They have been at the forefront of legislative reform to shift the societal paradigm around mental health. Vesper, as a MAD, queer, Indigenous person, has made it their life's mission to rewrite the narrative mental health industrial complex that it's been enforced on our society. Moore is a MAD, queer, Indigenous person of Kiskaya and Borinquen Taino descent and uses they, them pronouns. And feel free to correct me if I mispronounced either of those. I'm so excited to be with all of you here today. So let's get started. First and foremost, I wanted to ask you about your experiences with just being family members or loved ones of people who have been who have experienced a mental health crisis and what that was like for you. Does anybody want to start?
Sure, I'll get started. I don't want to come after anyone else in case there's some more impactful stories, but definitely want to start by thanking the ARC for having me here and inviting me to speak in today's conference. Along with my new role as Behavioral Health Policy Associate at the National Academy for State Health Policy, I am a person with lived experience in the mental health system and a close family member of someone with autism. A year ago, I wrote a blog post titled From a Moment of Crisis to a Reason for Hope that you mentioned in my bio, Tony. And I felt then, as I do now, that it was important to share my story in the hopes that it would lead to change in the unethical mental health crisis response that was far too common across the country. So for me, my personal ordeal took place in September 2020, coincidentally Suicide Prevention Month. I was a stressed out graduate student in Atlanta with vague thoughts of self-harm that were worsened by the uncertainty from the pandemic. So I decided to schedule an appointment with a telehealth therapist provided through my school. My therapy appointment was around 8 p.m. one night. I started telling my therapist about my thoughts of self-harm, and to my surprise, within 5 minutes of our session, the therapist felt it was appropriate to call 911. And literally it was just 5 minutes. It was very fast. So after that call, everything happened so quickly. 2 police officers arrived at my door. And though it was raining very heavily at that time, I felt it was better to meet with them outside the house where I was living to avoid disturbing my sleeping roommate inside. I tried to remain calm and clear with the police, but I couldn't help stuttering a bit while explaining why the therapist decided to call 911. The officer closest to me was on guard the entire time. He kept his hand at the gun in his holster, and I remember looking and turning towards my car because it had my umbrella, but decided against asking to get it since both officers literally reached for their guns when I made even the slightest movements. The situation was unnecessarily tense, and I was honestly terrified. I felt I was at even greater risk when dealing with the police because I'm Black. When the ambulance finally showed up, I was patted down to make sure I was clear of any weapons. I felt like a criminal. I ended up spending 4 hours in the ER in the middle of a COVID surge in the area. I was deemed not suicidal and allowed to go back home that same night, but I still would have to pay hundreds of dollars out of pocket for the visit, even though I had insurance coverage through my school. When I reflect on my story, the truth is that it could have been much worse. Although I was scared, I had enough presence of mind to explain my situation to the police. And when I think about that, and I think about my close family member with autism, I feel that he would have more difficulty in that situation. And that is what really scares me, honestly. During my situation, I was even called nice after holding conversations with the EMTs and staff in the ER. Although I suppose they meant to compliment me, their comments made me feel angry and still make me feel angry. I couldn't help thinking about the people in crisis who aren't, quote, nice, who are vulnerable and scared and met with police and force instead of a compassionate mental health response. So I've decided to share my story to shed light on how broken our current mental health crisis response is, and of course, our overall mental health system is, and why I have to hold on to hope that 988 could be a catalyst for transforming emergency mental health care and ideally leading to a future where safe intervention is the new norm for everyone. Thank you.
And based on your experience that you went through, how did that impact how you how you had your conversations with your family member who has autism, and the way in which you just kind of prepared that family member, or have attempted to prepare your family member for potential encounters like that.
I've definitely tried to prepare him the best I can. I don't think he knows about this particular experience of mine, but we talk often about, how to talk whenever the police are on the scene and kind of what not to do. And unfortunately, he can kind of seem, he can be a little like shifty and like seem, I guess to those who don't know him, maybe suspicious just because when you first see him, you may not know he has a disability. And so he just, has some kind of some awkward movements. And so I told him before not to just listen whenever police are talking with him, and because he can be kind of blunt, and to try to be very respectful. But at the end of the day, he's very strong-willed. He's now 22 years old. He's an adult, and he knows about the police, and he knows about injustice towards Black people and Black men specifically. But at the same time, it still is, probably one of my greatest fears, that he'll end up in a situation where he is by himself with the police, or in any kind of crisis, and that he's not able to fully articulate what's going on, and that he's not able to get the help that he needs.
And that's why it's crucial that we just have people who are put in situations who can de-escalate and are not, gonna put people in situations that can escalate situations and lead to harm.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to continue on to Carlene. Just what's your story?
Thank you. So my story is that of an activist, and working with families who have been absolutely devastated by the loss of a loved one when there is a crisis. And sometimes it is the families themselves who have had to pick up that phone, which probably feels like 100 pounds, particularly if you are Black and you have a loved one who is experiencing a mental health crisis. And what other option is there? What other option have we had besides calling 911? I have heard calls where families have actually said, my son is, having a mental health crisis. My son is whatever it is. He's schizophrenic, whatever it is. My son is Black, do not kill him. And that is an extreme that people have to go through when making that decision to get help for a loved one in crisis, when they feel that, the situation is out of their hands. They don't have any other options. We have one option, which is why we're talking about, what it means to transform crisis response throughout the day, and whether that one option was ever the right option. Is it the right option today? What are the alternatives, and how do we get there? And so, just later on in our presentation, I will show you a video clip from one of the families that I have worked with and continue to support as an activist. But there was a mother who lost her son. There's a father who lost his son. There's a teenage brother whose big brother is gone because he just wasn't doing well. Needed some help. Thank you.
And Vesper, could you just talk a little bit about some of your experiences with a family member or a loved one who's gone through a crisis, and how that impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely. I come here with a lot of different experiences, and currently I work as an activist, and really as a chief operating officer of a peer-run organization called the Kiva Centers, and we do a lot of work through that lens of really contextualizing suicide, right? Like really thinking about like what leads to communities being impacted in this way, right? And I think sometimes that's a part of it when we're talking about crisis response. It's the contextualization of our experiences and what's happening. And sometimes there's a very difficult response. I'd say for me, as a person who has had a police interaction after a suicide attempt, police come into the space and have taken up the space, right? They're responding in a way of kind of securing the space in a way that is necessary, that can be distressing, whether if it's intended to or not, whether if it meets that protocol, and that response needs to change. But for me, in terms of a family member, my mom attempted suicide a few years ago after I had, um, and she was going through a divorce, and she had called me and told me that she had taken too much of her medication. She had told me that there was a place where she had set some money aside in case if I needed it, and she wasn't directly telling me that I took too much medication and and it was out of an attempt to take my life. It was more or less a here here's this money. I might have messed up. Here's what we're looking at. And the response very much was having police come into the space once again, having a line of questioning, you know what I mean? And it's it's really, there is something so deeply unsettling about that as Black and brown people, largely. I my mom and I have had several experiences of being profiled because she immigrated from the Dominican Republic, and um and myself growing up as a Hispanic person, there have been moments where someone who's fitting the description of a long-haired Hispanic male and being brought into a police department and detained for a few hours of questioning when in fact they had the wrong person. I was coming back from school, you know. But anyway, I talk about a lot of these experiences because I'm trying to bring in context, because I think we can talk about the circumstances and we're like, well, clearly if they were a risk to themselves, we should have responded in this way. We should have done this, right? But when you are already determining someone's a danger because you look at them because of our ideas, or the racist ideas that are embedded in our society, right? That reaction is something that has to be addressed. So my mom ended up spending 3 days in Pembroke. She found it to be a deeply disturbing and unsettling experience for her, being in that hospital. Um, and the reason why it was so difficult was because she found herself needing to defend herself from other people who were struggling, and from staff who were really telling her that this was the method of treatment, this is what she had to comply with, and if she didn't do it, she was non-compliant. So it was the first time she was able to relate to some of my experiences um, in these systems, in these spaces.
And I think it's really interesting how all three of you have just talked about just the way in which race kind of exacerbates some of the situations that people are going through. And I'm wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit more about just why race has an impact on how people view the police when they show up in these situations, and um, really how that impacts the family responses, and what how can we fix this, how can we make these situations more equitable and safer, quite frankly, for people who are of color, who are experiencing situations of crisis, and their family members.
I was just gonna quickly respond. I think it's a continuum to what the response is, right? It's not one person or like one professional responding or one group responding, but rather it's a community response to policing.
Yeah, and as an activist, I'm seeing some of my answer will come from that perspective, and I'm seeing some of the information that's put in the chat. We had a question. Someone is talking about her local police agency actually brought in. She said they brought in an outside agency to handle crisis intervention. But what's happening is that they are unable to, it sounds like they're unable to meet the capacity for that community, the need. And she says it's resulting in sort of a catch and release of a handful of repeat people who deserve to receive longer term help more than a 1 to 2 hour lockup. So that to me is not the solution. Whatever's happening in that community is not the solution. First, I don't think that armed law enforcement was ever the right choice or the right option to respond to somebody in a mental health crisis. As we get into the solutions portion of today, I'll talk a little bit about the principles of the coalition. And one of the key principles of today's conference, one of the key principles is really that we need to treat mental health and behavioral health issues the same way that we would treat physical health issues. So if armed law enforcement is not the right response for somebody going into cardiac arrest, they're not the right response to somebody who is perhaps overstimulated at the airport, somebody who's autistic and overstimulated at the airport and having, what we call a meltdown. Armed law enforcement wouldn't be the right response there either. And I saw, in the chat, somebody else talking about issues around being, a person of color and just general, issues around disability not being something at the forefront of a lot of people that we might encounter, particularly mental health disabilities. And, there are reasons for that, because there's, the high percentages of particularly of Black people who are killed just in law enforcement encounters. It doesn't really matter the scenario, traffic, crisis, just walking. Just a high percentage of numbers of Black people are killed by law enforcement. Well, if you add a crisis situation, or if you add somebody with a disability, perhaps deafness on top of that, the likelihood of that threat just grows, because, there are incidents of people who are deaf, who Black people who have been stopped by police, and, they're given those rapid second commands, and they can't hear them, of course, but they're also not given an opportunity to explain that they can't hear them before the weapons come out. I mean, Miriam talked about that in her experience, and, being able to make some quick, rapid fire decisions to keep herself safe. I mean, she was thinking about getting an umbrella because it was raining, but decided, wait a minute, he's got his hand on his holster, and decided, we'll let the umbrella go. But if you are not able to rapid firely think and make those decisions to keep yourself safe, and why would you be, if you're having some sort of mental health crisis, why would you be expected to make those decisions? You shouldn't have to. My point is that armed law enforcement only really heightens the threat to somebody who's already vulnerable. We really need to be thinking about, what does it mean to actually create a crisis, a civilian crisis corps for the country that is just as fast as 911, right? When we call 911 and say, I don't know, somebody's breaking into a building, we need to be able to call, if it's going to be 988, which is an easy 3-digit number, to remember, and have them be able to access all around the country ground support services that can mobilize and actually help people resolve issues without bringing violence, without bringing weapons to that scenario.
And I mean, that's a wonderful segue. Just thinking about the solutions, having that ground force. And I was also thinking about, a lot of people I think have a basic understanding of just the need for assistance beyond police, right? Beyond armed forces, an armed individual who's coming into a situation like this. But I think people are very quick to just jump on recommending social workers, for instance, in lieu of police, without really having a conversation about all of the ways in which social workers or therapists have harmed Black and Brown communities and the disabled community as well. And I was looking in the chat and somebody kind of brought that up. 86% of therapy offices are physically inaccessible for BIPOC people with a mental health disability, as well as an access and functional needs disability. So who is there to represent them? What does it mean to be BIPOC and deaf? An attempt to deal with the police. But that just got me thinking, how can we, again, make sure that these spaces are safe and that we are improving situations for people who are going through a crisis. Just even using alternatives to the police. Just if you could provide your thoughts on that and what that could look like, especially from the perspective of a family member.
Sure. So I think, that's such an important perspective about solutions, and maybe also really, prioritizing listening to communities, as Vesper was kind of alluding to earlier. It's just so important to listen to the people who are actually impacted and to give them the power to create the solutions that are best. I think for me, and I do want to clarify that I'm speaking, of course, from my own personal opinion, and this is not representing where I work at all. But, for me, as someone who's works in policy, I think so often we think about, kind of what seems to be the natural thing within the system that already exists. So like you mentioned, social workers, therapists, those are great. So, in some cases. However, as you mentioned, there are harms that therapists and the mental health system has created towards those people of color and those with disabilities. And, just thinking back to my own situation, after that incident, I didn't reach out to a therapist for like a year and a half, although I definitely needed the support. I just felt totally uncomfortable with reaching out and speaking in that way because of what it could lead to. And so that's really unfortunate, obviously. And I think that for me, I would have really liked to have had some place where I could have gone or spoken to someone who I felt I could trust and who I knew wouldn't feel like I was a liability and that my personal mental health issues were a liability to them, that they had to kind of shift away to the next intervention, so to speak. But I think that it's just really important to really listen to those who are most impacted. And when it comes to disabled folks and those with different abilities, it's important to reach out to them and to include them in the decision making, and to really prioritize that, I think.
Yeah, and if I could add, a good response, another response that has been, I think it's still being built more. I think there's definitely more efforts emerging that are peer-run efforts, peer-run supports. Um, the Kiva Center is the organization that I'm a part of. We offer peer-run respite, and we have a place that's called the Karaya Peer Run Respite in Massachusetts, and it's a 6-room house with multiple bathrooms. People stay for 5 to 7 days. They manage their own medication. They stay there for a period of time. They go direct from the emergency room or from a response like this to stay there. And then if they need to stay longer, they can request an extension and they can stay up to 30 days. Sometimes we've had people stay up to that period of time, particularly if they're unhoused and they're really struggling. And that's a circumstance that's a part of that as well. But a big thing that we've been trying to do more of is our mobile peer respite, where we go to folks anywhere in the state and we support them for up to 4 hours at a time. Um, but another piece is capacity, it's funding, it's really doing more with efforts like this. There's only 30 peer respites in the country. I'll definitely drop a directory of the peer respites in the chat as an alternative. And there are warm lines as well. So like if someone felt like not necessarily like they wanted to call 988 right away, there's also a warm line which has set hours, set times when they have suicidal thoughts that they want to speak through. But if you really feel like you're going to attempt, as well as as having these different options, there's also Black Line, which is a Black run call line, that I think a lot of folks don't know about, and the Trans Lifeline too, or Trans Line, for trans folks. Those are important because it's also important who you're talking to. Does the person you're talking to share those experiences? Because I think that can be important as well in those circumstances. That's not to say that people who don't share the experiences can't respond. It's just having more options is important in the overall response. Because when we talk about social workers can be a form of police for different communities for a variety of reasons, and are definitely not an alternative to every situation. But that's not to say that a social worker cannot help someone in a situation, because they have. There are many social workers who have.
So with that, I want to jump to the video that Carlene is planning to share, and then we can kind of move back to our conversation.
Yes, we will do that. And we're taking I just did a little bit of housekeeping. We're taking questions in the Q&A. So if you have questions, you can actually put them in the Q&A. That's the best place for them. Matthew says, say disabled or person with a disability. Yes, I'm a person with a disability. It's okay. I think all the panelists have identified as people with disabilities. So people of color with disabilities. And the video that I'm going to show is from a press conference of one of the families that I have supported and can continue to support through the loss of their son. His name is Ryan. His name was Ryan LaRue. Ryan was 21 years old. He's local to me. He was killed in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Ryan was having a period of just, tough time. This was during a year or so ago with COVID still very much raging and disrupting lives. And he ended up, just to set the scene, he ended up at a McDonald's. He was in his car where I guess he had been sleeping for a few nights. And police were called. They thought he was disruptive to business outside of the McDonald's. But a lot of interesting sort of behind the scenes stuff that you may not hear in the video. But even when the police were called, the folks who made the call were aware that this person was perhaps struggling with a mental health issue. But again, we generally don't know another number besides 911. And once police were called, my issue as an activist is that, they could make the assessment that this was somebody who was in a crisis situation. And from that point, they should have stood down and they should have engaged crisis services. I live in a county that has crisis services, and police unfortunately still very much make that determination as to if they will or will not engage crisis services. And I think, we have to talk about, when we talk about solutions, we have to talk about what is their role in making that determination. Should they have the singular role in making the determination as to whether or not to engage crisis response services? What's the role of the community? What's the role of people? So I am going to share my screen, and you will hear a little bit of the press conference with the parents. And I might show you a little bit from the attorney, because there is a lawsuit and the lawsuit is brought under the ADA, so the Americans with Disabilities Act, because it's specifically recognizing this was a person with disabilities. The way that he was treated by law enforcement not only certainly robbed him of his life, but there were no reasonable accommodations made. So, and where they could have been. So bear with me as I cue up the video.
In the meantime, I'm looking at the Q&A, and Micah brought up this great point that a large barrier is pay disparity. Compare the average pay between social workers, licensed or not, or DD/ID professionals, and police officers. And the police officers are more likely to be on top. So how can we realistically build out these larger scale community response networks without addressing this pay disparity and supporting the potential workforce? And, that's kind of moving beyond, I guess, this panel, because that's more of a, a solutions piece than the impacted families. But since that's a wonderful question. And since it was brought up, I'm wondering if you all have some thoughts on that.
Again, this is my own opinion, but this is, I think, where reallocation comes in, shifting funds away from things that haven't worked and systems that haven't worked, and bolstering workforces and workers who we know are better for the types of responses that we're looking for, especially with disabled folks and with people of color, Black communities, indigenous communities. I think there is a lot of evidence that public health responses and non-punitive responses are needed for mental health crises. And I think it's just a matter of finding the courage and the political will to move money where it's, better suited.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of people don't assume carcerality in mental health. Like, non-carceral approaches are imperative. And when I say non-carceral, I mean non-punishment based, ones that do focus on a healing response, that are led by those communities for those communities. The implementation is important. And I think funding those workforces and those efforts is a part of it, but also funding organizations that are doing the work to help implement in other states, tribal territories, spaces. I was doing some work with the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration on a recovery plan for the United States, and we're still working on it. And one thing that was really important was allocating and investing funds into technical assistance from peer-run organizations to do more mobile peer-run responses, to have that alternative in place, right? To have more options.
While Carlene is still figuring out the sound.
Or I was gonna say, we can try it again. People were giving me tips. People were giving me tips in the chat. So I will try it again. And I also sent it to our events coordinator. Here we go. So you can hear this?
For killing our son Ryan when he raised his hand or his cell phone. To protect and serve is their motto, but we believe to protect and to serve themselves is their motto. There are 17 officers at the scene, and allegedly all were wearing cameras. There was also video captured from the drive-through window at McDonald's. There's only one camera that's significant, and it shows only a shadow of Ryan getting up quickly from his reclined position and raising his right hand or cell phone. Raising your hands, as we all know, is a sign of surrender. None of these officers gave Ryan the benefit of the doubt. Ryan did have a legally registered handgun in his vehicle, but he would have never used it to threaten anyone. He purchased it for his own protection. Ryan recently lost his housing, was living out of the vehicle, and was suffering from a series of hardships, complicated by his mental health problems at that time. The Montgomery County Police attempted to show us a grainy, inconclusive, produced video with added red arrows, indicating Ryan allegedly raising a handgun with his right hand. Our son Ryan was left-handed, and he made a special effort to change the hand grips for a lefty when he purchased his gun. Ryan sat at the McDonald's restaurant in need of desperate mental health assistance and service, and was threatening no one. The initial 911 caller from McDonald's proves this. The family and many people in the community were hopeful and expecting that maybe this time the preventable taking of life of yet another black male would be met with some accountability. The criminal outcome for the officers was predictable based on the past, black lives lost in Montgomery County. Ron and I truly believe if the person experiencing this mental health crisis was white or a relative of the police officers, they would have responded completely different, with assistance, not 23 bullets. After reviewing all the evidence with the Howard County State's Attorney Office, our takeaway was that, and I quote, Ryan should still be alive today, unquote. We filed a civil lawsuit in the effort to prevent another Ryan from being dehumanized, gunned down like a rabid animal, and to hold Montgomery County accountable. It's evident that we have a problem in Maryland, and especially Montgomery County, a county that is allegedly liberal, progressive, and inclusive. Through this lawsuit, we will attempt to identify the need to retrain police officers and eliminate the fear-based training that seems to be so prevalent in the police forces. We'd like to try to modify the laws so that there isn't carte blanche to kill with little or no accountability from our police forces. I want to thank you all for coming and helping us keep the facts of this tragic event transparent and alive, and we will continue to update as our civil lawsuit proceeds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. William. So at this time, if you all have any questions of the family, we certainly can go ahead and entertain a few.
Does his mom want to say anything or just respond to questions?
No, my husband speaks.
If you have a question, I could possibly answer it.
Okay, I also wanted to speak to the attorney, and we had spoken over the phone about the federal lawsuit and the counts and the way you're pursuing this through ADA and things like that. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, certainly. It doesn't take one long to look at how our country or how our country's police forces have responded to people in mental health crisis. And typically, when something like that happens, lawyers like myself bring lawsuits under 42 USC Section 1983. While that's one avenue to bring such a lawsuit, we've brought this lawsuit under primarily the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, because the heart of this lawsuit is that Ryan should be alive today because he was someone reaching out for help, not committing a crime. And he should be alive today because he was in a mental health crisis, again, reaching out for help. And so while we might still bring a lawsuit, as many people do, for excessive force under 42 U.S.C. 1983, as a first measure, we're bringing this lawsuit under the Americans with Disabilities Act because that's really the heart of this case. Ryan had a disability because he was suffering from a mental health crisis, and the Montgomery police officers involved knew it and should have responded accordingly. So that's why we're bringing the lawsuit under the ADA. That's why, again, the heart of this lawsuit is Ryan's disability, that being his mental health.
And I wanted to stop right there, just so that you heard just a little bit of some of the legal claims and the fact that the attorney and the family, they're very cognizant that disability, along with Blackness, you know, and mental health played a role in the very quick and violent demise of their son, who was in crisis and in a scenario where, you know, it actually took police about 90 minutes to arrive to the scene because it wasn't, you know, they didn't think that it was a situation that warranted an immediate response. They were comfortable letting this young man stay where he was for 90 minutes, which tells you that there was no immediate threat to anybody. Nobody was being threatened by the young man sitting in his car. But once police arrived, I mean, they escalated so quickly, and 23 shots were fired. Whereas, you know, 90 minutes ago, everything was fine. And so, you know, the attorney and family, again, recognizing the fact that, you know, Ryan was not at the top of his game. You know, he was not able to make those, you know, rapid fire decisions and responses the way that, you know, we heard Miriam talk about earlier. And he was penalized for it. He was penalized. He was killed. And, you know, I wanted to host this session on the impacted families because the devastation that mother has, that father, the grandmother died shortly after. You know, we don't think about that. We don't think about the fact that these types of tragedies, these losses hit families so hard that other family members can die in response to the grief and the trauma. And that is what happened here. Ryan has a younger brother. And I think about what it's like for that young man, that young Black man, to travel in spaces, you know, in his Black body. And I'm sure that he will have incidents where he's pulled over by law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. What is it like for him knowing that his brother was taken so quickly and so violently when his brother was in crisis? You know, these families have to get up and they have to live. They have to reintegrate into the world every day. And I don't think that we as a society pay enough attention to the trauma. And it's really generational trauma we're talking about at this point, that families experience when something like this happens. In a recent, when this matter went to court, this was, I think, in Wichita. There was a family who made the very difficult decision to call 911 when a son, an adult son and a veteran, was having a mental health crisis. And he, again, met with police and killed almost instantly. And there was a quote from, I'm not sure if it was the mom or the sister, but she said, "We have to live with this. We made the call that killed him."
I was struck by the mother in that video that you shared, and just you could see in her face, you know, her expressions, the pain that she was going through. And I mean, we can talk all day about solutions that need to be done, improvements that can still be made with 988, because we know that it's not a perfect alternative. But what advice do you have for people who have lived with this, who have gone through this and do have to wake up every day just thinking my son, my brother, my cousin is not alive because of how somebody else reacted to a situation that they were going through, and how do you support them through that process on an individual level and as a community, as we were talking about earlier.
And as a community, I think that's why it's so important that we're hosting, this conference and having this national conversation today, because this topic has to be elevated to the level of importance that it deserves. The people who are impacted need to be seen. And I also think it's why we're having the workshop piece, which is, if you followed the bit.ly link that Juan put in the chat, in the lobby chat, and in the chat here, we're asking people to actually engage with their local communities and find out what's going on. Does your community have an alternative, for people who are in experiencing mental health or behavioral health crises? Is 911 the only option? Who makes the decision? That's what I'm experiencing as an on-the-ground activist here where I live in Montgomery County. Is the police still make the decision. While we have crisis services, they determine whether or not to engage them. So that's where we're at. Mm-hmm. And we've got to continue pushing forward. But first, you've got to get the answers. You've got to educate yourself. Where is your community?
And part of that community process too, it involves business leaders, right? Somebody just in the chat was talking about how a lot of times it's not just family members who are making these calls, it's businesses. And who are they calling? 911, not necessarily, even since its implementation, 988. And they need to be held accountable for the steps that they are taking when situations occur. So part of that is educating the businesses too that are located within communities.
And I know we're running behind, so I want to give all of you a chance to wrap up. And we have a question in the chat about pay disparity when it comes to social workers, whether they're licensed or not, developmental disability or intellectual disability specialists like case managers. And the question is, can we realistically build out these larger scale community response networks without addressing this pay disparity in supporting the potential workforce? And I just want to say, for that question, you must come to our solutions panel. We are going to have an executive director of a very large association of social workers at that panel. And she had some direct experience in advocating for these types of large scale changes and some thoughts on what we can do there. So definitely show up for the solutions panel later today. We have a question, how would your experience have been if there was an access or a functional needs disability? I think that's a great question. I was thinking a little bit about that earlier, and just some of the incidents that I have seen, and probably some of you others have seen across the country, where you can have people who are clearly paralyzed, and maybe they're stopped, in a traffic situation. It's not a mental health crisis situation, but their disability is obvious, it's apparent, and I have still seen these people treated very, very aggressively during law enforcement encounters. So I don't know, sometimes I think, race is the first barrier, race and then maybe disability after that. But so I don't know if that would necessarily change the response. Vesper, Miriam, Tony, does anybody else have a?
Sure. So I saw this question. I've been thinking about it as well. I think honestly, it probably would in my case, just because I did, step out of where I was living and, was able to communicate with the police. But I think about my close family member. He did not want our relationship identified. So this is why I'm calling him my close family member. But anyway, I think about my close family member, and he has broken speech, and I know that he would have trouble communicating what was going on in that situation. And I also think about folks who wouldn't be able to get up and out of their house, and who would have police coming into their house, and the invasion that that would place on them and their physical presence. I think that's, you know, extra disturbing to me, to think about being even more vulnerable in that situation. So I think that it definitely, again, could have been much worse for me if I had other disabilities, especially those that kind of limited my access. And that's really why, partly, that I'm here, is to speak about the importance of making sure 988 is implemented effectively and appropriately, and leads to greater changes, that leads to more appropriate mental health crisis responses for people of color and for disabled people, because I think it's really important that, especially with disabled folks, that they are, you know, centered in this conversation on 988, because I think that I haven't seen it as often in policy conversations talking about folks with disabilities or the IDD population. And I think that it's going to be essential moving forward.
Vesper, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, and I think with that, you know, there are so many different helping professions that are primarily run by folk that do not look like us. And I mean that as disabled folk, I mean that as, you know, Black and brown folk, I mean that like in many different contexts. And there's some harmful history there too. I mean, if you look at the history of the Detroit riots and the amount of individuals who are diagnosed with schizophrenia on the basis of their association with civil rights movement and civil unrest, right? If you look at some of that harmful history that the American Psychiatric Association has apologized for, they issued an apology publicly, I want to say over a year ago now, maybe a year and a half ago. There is some contextual history there. So you see a lot of that mentality that's existed historically, that's existed for a long time, a policing mentality, something that's focused on liability, but also how you can control a situation and what's happening in a situation. And you see that in mental health professionals, and that has to change too. I think that it's a multi-layered, multifaceted issue when we look at working through these things, because then we can think about how do we make something more accessible, and then you beg the question, accessible to what if it's carceral, right? So yeah.
And I just want to, you know, elevate this final comment at the end, that, you know, it's really important to think about the intersectionality with this. And a lot of our conversation today has been focused on people with developmental disabilities, or, you know, who are going through a mental health crisis. But there are other disabled people who are also BIPOC within our communities, who are, you know, experiencing negative treatment by the police as they are, you know, going through certain experiences. So it is important to also think about, you know, Black and brown and Asian, deaf people, visually impaired people, paraplegic, as we think about these conversations, and as we have conversations with various stakeholders like policymakers about solutions. They should also be at the table. But with that, I want to thank you all for joining me today on this Impacted Families in Crisis Response session. And, you know, I hope that you all will continue to join us for our other select sessions as we, you know, look into more of the solutions.
As we continue, and we're going to start the solutions portion next, right after our lunch break. And again, you know, this is great information. We're definitely running behind, but please bear with us and hang out with us for the day.